The Battle of Maribou was King John's greatest military victory. He had captured his biggest rival, his nephew, Duke Arthur of Brittany, and the Lusignans, the family that caused the uprising against King John due to him charging them for treason. While King John initially started on the defence by securing his castles around Normandy, his one offensive move turned the situation around for him. But, as we will see, his personality and actions would reduce his greatest military achievement to a simple footnote in his saga. In this final episode, we'll see King John lose the empire he so desperately tried to gain, and the conflict that would see his painful and dull end, the First Barons' War. The news of Arthur and his allies' capture forced King Philip to retreat to reorganize his forces. It seemed King John was once again on the cusp of sweeping all his enemies before him. Yet King John's treatment of Arthur is possibly the worst action of his reign, and a damning chapter of King John's legacy, the mystery of Arthur's death. Arthur was first locked up at Falaise, and then moved and disappeared at Rouen. The boy's body has never been found. While it's impossible to say whether he was murdered or died trying to escape, the general consensus is that King John had Arthur murdered. Plenty of chroniclers attest as such. The motives for Arthur's murder by King John are compelling. First, he was the only male rival for the whole of the Angevin Empire. And if Arthur married and produced children, those children would become rivals against King John's, or replacements, if, for example, powerful barons wanted King John replaced. Arthur was also firmly allied to King Philip. And finally, one influence towards murder is King John's time in Ireland when he was a young man of 18. We've mentioned how Irish politics influenced King John, particularly dealing with rivals, as in Ireland, killing hostages and rivals was simple politics. In King John's mind, it would have been easier to permanently get rid of Arthur as opposed to coming to terms and releasing him, as Arthur could renege on any oath sworn. However, that course of agreement is the norm of the time in high Middle Ages England and France. A secondary problem is that if Arthur did die trying to escape, King John would have been compelled to display the body in state to try and dispel any rumours of murder. And as no remains were ever produced, it's more evidence towards that King John had his nephew killed. Rumours of Arthur's fate spread all across England and France. One of the most vicious rumours was that King John had personally killed Arthur in a drunken rage, and then had his corpse dumped in the River Seine. Killing a close relative, especially one of high nobility, was reprehensible. Not only this, but King John had treated his prisoners in such vile ways that some of his allies began to desert him and join King Philip. One account, the Margam Abbey Chronicle, located in Wales, records that King John had captured Arthur and kept him alive in prison for some time in the castle of Rouen. After dinner on the Thursday before Easter, when he was drunk and possessed by the devil, King John killed him with his own hand, and tying a heavy stone to the body, cast it into the Seine. Matthew Paris and Ralph of Coggeshall both offer different tales of the fate of Arthur, yet both are recording in different times. Coggeshall is chronicling around the time, and Paris is recording decades later. Whatever fate befell Arthur, we will never know for certain, but the legacy of his disappearance is another damning condemnation of King John. The consequences for King John would be losing the support of the Norman nobility, and more of his allies was simply swapping one direct liege lord for another, King Philip. From Anjou to Poitou, the Angevin Empire was rapidly crumbling. There was also the wrath of the Bretons, angry at the perceived killing of their lord. The military situation for King John by 1203 was becoming untenable. King Philip was invading Normandy again in Easter, and by August, the French king was besieging the mighty fortress of Chateau Gilliard, King Richard's pride and joy castle. As for King John, at the start of 1203, he was trying to make amends with the Lusignans by releasing Hugh and Geoffrey, freeing the men of the family that began the event that would turn into the disastrous situation, was a desperate last measure to try and secure Poitou. But that plan turned into smoke once King John received the news that his wife was trapped at Chinon. Once again, King John made a desperate dash towards Chinon with his army, passing Alençon, when, a few miles away from the town, King John received further news that the Count of Alençon, Robert, had switched sides and received troops to bolster the town. King John's rearguard was now exposed. The pure anger King John felt is recorded in his own documents for the year. Instead of stating, "in the 4th year of our reign," he states, "the year when Count Robert betrayed us." As for King Philip, his plan was still the same, the conquest of Normandy. The repercussions of Arthur's murder would benefit Philip in the future. For now, siege warfare was the business of the day, and King Philip would display his mastery of besieging and capturing castles. King John had managed to send one of his knights to Chinon to escort his wife Isabella to Le Mans. While King John had been busy organising the defence of his lands, writing writs and shoring up his castles, King John was also seeking papal help to help bring the conflict to an end, in order to secure his positions around Normandy and deal with unruly counts around his lands across France. But, despite attempts at mediation, King Philip refused. He knew King John lacked support within his own territories and wanted nothing else but the conquest of Normandy. And by March 1203, more barons and lords were swapping out John for Philip as their liege lord. King John had few allies he could trust, and the mercenaries King John hired were only loyal to coin or what plunder they could obtain. One baron King John did trust was William de Brieux, a powerful baron. He held lands all across England, Ireland, Normandy, and Wales, thanks to King John. But one loyal baron wasn't enough, and John was rapidly losing the support of the Normans. For the last 10 years, had experienced an almost constant cycle of warfare, plus the cost of such wars. And by May 1203, Anjou and Maine had fallen to King Philip. While King John did try at the start of King Philip's offensive to obtain peace by offering money, when that failed, he tried to organise what defences he could and managed to seize back a few castles in Normandy during the summer of 1203. But John lacked so much support and was running empty on funds, even after quickly sacking around Brittany in September. The situation was becoming so dire that William Marshal bluntly put it to King John that, "Sire, listen to what I have to say. You have few friends. If you choose to strengthen your enemies, then your own power will decline. If a man strengthens his enemies, it is justifiable for men to attack. You paid no attention to the first sign of discontent, but it would have been better for us all if you had." While that quote comes from the deeds of William Marshal, an account detailing the Marshal's life, and is favourable to him, we can imagine a conversation similar to that occurring between John and William. King John's reaction saw the return of the Angevin anger, and he marched to his chambers enraged. The situation was terrible, and King John, after promising to return with support from the English barons and to gather more funds, left Normandy on the 5th of December 1203. Without knowing it, that was the last time he ever saw Normandy again. King John landed at Portsmouth on the 7th of December 1203, in time to enjoy Christmas at Canterbury, where he mused to the Archbishop of Canterbury that he was forced to leave Normandy due to treachery. In French sources, he gained a new nickname, Soft Sword, meaning a lack of fight or bravery to defend Normandy to the last man, as his brother and father might have done. But the nickname of Lackland returns as well. While King John was in England, the important Chateau Gilliard was still under heavy siege, and while this impressive castle could hold out better than most castles King Philip had captured, without support the castle would fall. King John did make one attempt to relieve the castle earlier in that year. It failed. By February 1204, King Philip's forces had collapsed the outer wall of the castle. By the start of March, only the keep remained, and on the 6th of March 1204, the remaining garrison of Chateau Gilliard were dragged out. The fall of this castle acted as a domino effect across Normandy. Towns and cities just gave up without a fight. Why fight for a duke who wasn't present? The most important city in Normandy, Rouen, would have been a daunting challenge to capture. The city featured impressive walls and plenty of hazardous ditches to any besieger. But this army wasn't some rabble rebel army. This was the army of the King of France. King Philip arrived to take control of what he and his court deemed lawful, and after securing an agreement with the commander of the city that, if no help arrived from John in 30 days, the city would be open to King Philip. The city of Rouen capitulated a week before the agreement ended. Normandy, for the first time in over 300 years, was now in the direct control of the King of France, quite a change from King of Franks. John, meanwhile, was enjoying a good hunt and later celebrating his Ascension Day of becoming King of England. The Angevin Empire was no more. While Normandy had fallen, so had most of the other Angevin lands, and even worse news in April 1204, Queen Eleanor had died. Her death created uncertainty in the Duchy of Aquitaine, and lords within Aquitaine were eager to offer direct homage to King Philip over John, who by rights of succession was now the Duke of a faltering duchy. The victory at Mirabeau was now a hollow memory. The city of Chinon also fell to King Philip in September. Most of King John's loyal men had returned with him to England. The major problem for some of these barons was that they held both lands in France and in England, and with the conquest of Normandy, Anjou, etc., they had to choose which lord to perform homage to, John or now King Philip. There was also the economy aspect, which was exacerbated by inflation. Northern Europe from 1170 onwards seems to have experienced a period of sharp monetary inflation. Wages and prices rocketed. King John, whose income depended upon fixed rents from lands, found himself with massively increased expenditure, but with no compensating rise, either in rents or profits of war. In these circumstances, his only alternative was to impose heavier taxations on his barons, themselves victims of precisely the same economic pressures as the king. While King John was dealing with the fallout over the loss of Normandy and trying to secure what remained of the Duchy of Aquitaine, he would battle his next political enemy, the Pope. The current head of the papacy was Innocent III. Another testament to King John's bad luck is that he faced great historical characters, and Innocent is considered one of the greatest popes who wielded significant political authority. He would clash with not just King John, but other kings as well, including King Philip of France. Pope Innocent was fully prepared to use the political might of the papacy to enforce the rights of the Church over the kings of Europe. The dispute between King John and Pope Innocent began with the death of Hubert Walters, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in July 1205. To control the powerful position of Archbishop would certainly be a benefit to King John, and he put forward a loyal man, John de Grey, the Bishop of Norwich. The bishop offered a tasty 5,000 marks for the position. As if King John could control the position, he could tax the clergy or extort more funds for campaigns. The relationship between king and archbishop had to be a positive working one, as King John's father, Henry II, had a disastrous relationship with one of his archbishops, Thomas Becket. Thankfully, King John never cried out, "Who shall deliver me from this turbulent priest?" While King John put forward his man for the role, the monks of Canterbury had their own choice, but King John exerted pressure on the monks to support his candidate to the Pope. Yet Pope Innocent rejected both in May 1206 and would directly appoint his own man to the position, even demanding that the monks of Canterbury travel to Rome in order for the election to be preceded by the papacy. All of this political back and forth took time, and King John was busy trying to coax more money from the clergy. After all, King John sought what his predecessors all wanted: royal control over the church. By June 1207, Pope Innocent made his choice. Stephen Langton, an Englishman who taught in Paris, would be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. King John was less than enthusiastic about this selection of Archbishop, and vented his anger towards the Pope in a letter, stating that Langton was a man altogether unknown to him, who had been familiar for a long time with his declared enemies in the Kingdom of France. King John would take some petty revenge, not on the Pope, but the nearest people he could find, the monks of Canterbury. John sent mercenaries with crossbows to harass the monks, with most of them fleeing. John then took their land and gave it to some of his loyal men. It seems King John wouldn't inadvertently kill an archbishop as his father did. He just wouldn't have one. The rest of King John's letter to the Pope also mentioned that England had given plenty of dosh to the Papal State, but also that he would never stop to defend his rights as king, and in an incredibly bold move towards the Pope, which is one reason why the Tudors admired him, John would just ignore the Catholic Church if he didn't get his way. The martyrdom of Thomas Becket was to be a strong parallel to Langton, as King John refused to allow him to enter England. The Pope responded by issuing an interdict on England. King John was now testing the political power of the Pope, a game he would eventually lose. In the meantime, King John would take what he wanted from the clergy: money for more campaigns into France, establishing an effective system of taking the wives and lovers of the clergymen and selling them back to the men of the cloth, reveling in the hypocrisy. By 1209, Pope Innocent further flexed his authority and excommunicated King John, making King John the first ever King of England to be excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Yet King John neither feared God nor regarded man. It was as if he alone were mighty upon earth. Only military force could drag King John back into the fold, or he could be replaced. But who could replace him? Arthur had been dead for years, and by the year 1213, rumours were circulating that King Philip would be the one to invade England with the Pope's blessing, if King John did not submit to the Pope. King Philip was more than happy to provide his son Louis with the throne of England, as John's father, King Henry, had done with Ireland. But in a complete pivot, King John managed to save his kingdom and position from invasion on the 15th of May 1213, near Dover, in a manner that rivaled his father's penance, by swearing to the papal legate that he and the Kingdom of England and Ireland would be vassals of the Papal State. The invasion of England by King Philip was already dashed by the Earl of Salisbury, whose ships had destroyed the French fleet at Flanders, making the Pope's power null when compared to the soldiers who carried the day. All the Pope could do was wag his finger in disapproval if kings disobeyed him. And while King John was confined in England and creating plans to take back his lands in France, his neighbours, the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh, would unfortunately get to know him, as King John set about subjugating the whole of Britain and Ireland. We've already covered Ireland and King John's actions there. The princes of Wales and the King of Scots were prime targets for King John to flex his authority. King John started by meddling into the affairs of Wales, at first in 1199, where King John supported rivals in the Kingdom of Deheubarth, a once great kingdom in Wales, gaining land for himself. But King John also encountered another great historical figure, Llewellyn the Great. Llewellyn and King John came to an agreement. One of our sources state, Llewellyn swore an oath of allegiance to King John in 1201 and married Joan, the king's illegitimate daughter, in 1205. John was a man of unstable character, although recent research shows that he was not the monster of traditional portrayal. He had a genius for making enemies. This again alludes to King John's horrible personality. Wales did suffer from the effects of the Pope's interdict. There was also a renewed focus on conquering more of Wales, as King John had charged his favourite baron, William de Brioze, to take more land from the native Welsh princes. Yet William would suffer the most from his close relationship with King John, falling out and fleeing from Wales to Ireland and then finally to France, where he died. Llewellyn attempted to take advantage of the now power vacuum in Wales, and while he would be successful in the future, by 1210 Llewellyn was becoming powerful enough that King John would seek to curtail Llewellyn's rising power by invading Wales in 1211. The first invasion failed. The second ended when both armies were camped just across from each other, separated by a river. Llewellyn capitulated, and he came to an agreement with King John that if he failed to produce a male heir, King John would inherit his throne. Unsurprisingly, King John managed to annoy the Welsh by building castles on disputed lands. The Welsh revolted in 1212, while King John was still excommunicated, leading to the Pope to give his support to the Welsh. And Llewellyn found himself not only in a stronger position in a short turnaround, but now the King of France, Philip, was writing to him. Llewellyn's response was fangirling over King Philip. King John found himself unable to invade Wales due to planning an attack in France and had fallen out with his barons, which leads us to 1213. Now for Scotland. Since King John's ascension to the English throne in 1199, Scotland had been ruled by King William the Lion since 1165. King William is one of the longest ruling Scottish kings. During his lengthy reign, he lost Scotland temporarily as a kingdom to King Henry II, after joining the failed uprising against Henry, before buying back the kingdom from King Richard. But now dealing with King John, who sought to subjugate Scotland once more, and in 1209, King John invaded Scotland. By this time, William was old and frail, and no match for an invigorated King John, who had in his retinue his son-in-law, Llewellyn. The resulting invasion led to the Treaty of Norham, where the King of Scots had to pay a fat stack of cash and entrust hostages, which included two of the king's daughters. They would be married off through the English court. King William would never gain revenge in his lifetime, as he died in late 1214, but his successor, King Alexander II, would feature in the terms of the Magna Carta of 1215. With King John losing Normandy and being forced to stay in England for a time to build up funds and his power base, the barons of England would get to know their king more, as King John travelled extensively across England, staying in one location for a day or two and then moving on to the next. King John was an active king, always seeking cash through various means, taxation, fines, scutage, etc. Despite King John himself being particularly wealthy, the cost of such wars, from provisions to ships, outweighed King John's own personal wealth, making taxation a necessity. Now the barons of England had to deal with a king right on their doorstep, rather than howling for funds from France. The first attempt at recovering the lands in France was in 1205. That failed, and King John sought to blame William Marshal, even calling for the Marshal to be challenged by way of combat. Yet nobody took up the challenge. William Marshal had the phenomenal ability, when dealing with King John, of simply turning the other cheek. While the king raged and threw a tantrum, William was always able to come out on top. And in this situation, one of our sources tells us that King John, in despair, John sailed round the Isle of Wight before returning to his kingdom, having caused his subjects to fear that he had gone off to the continent on a reckless adventure without his army. The next attempt was in 1206. This expedition fared much better than the one in 1205. England and its borders were secure, and in June 1206, King John was back in France, landing at La Rochelle. King John had shown his talent for preparation by the safe arrival of this fleet, crossing the sea into enemy waters and making sure the cash for the campaign was well protected. King John was received warmly by the nobles of the area, and in turn King John released prisoners. Yet the arrival of King John's forces kicked the French King Philip into motion, who in turn organised a defence of Normandy and sent his loyal men to defend other regions in the area. But rather than march straight towards Normandy, King John set his sight on Bordeaux in the south, as King Alfonso VIII had invaded in 1204 on the context that the region of Gascony was his right by virtue of his marriage to Eleanor of England, King John's sister. Alfonso had already left for Castile, and by August King John had secured Gascony. Now he was free to march north and attempt to probe the defences of his former territories, reaching as far as Brittany. Yet King John didn't receive the warmest of welcomes. After all, he had killed the Duke of Brittany, and now being this close to Normandy, the French king himself soon arrived with his army. In one account, the French king pillaged around Thouars and flexed his military might by offering battle to King John, who was currently residing at Thouars. King John refused, and by October, King John had concluded a truce with King Philip over a 2-year period. Now King John had seen what kind of challenges he faced if he wanted the whole of his former territories back. King John would now spend the next 8 years building towards that goal at any cost, and King John would work towards building a strong coalition similar to the one he had cultivated back in 1200. Yet his tireless effort of raising such cash and his personality would cause his downfall. By 1212, preparations were underway to invade France again. As mentioned, the Welsh revolted. The English barons, particularly the northern barons, weren't interested in another round of invasions into a place they had no benefits in trying to take. The fires of rebellion were slowly being stoked. In 1210, landowners, knights, and clergymen were all feeling the brunt of King John's obsessive taxation, and they were fearful of King John due to his treatment of anyone who crossed him. The problem for King John is that this discontent was something to rally behind and find common ground to demand change. There were quite a few barons in England during the 13th century. Some were more extreme than others in their approach to dealing with problems. In August 1212, King John was staying at Nottingham, where he heard of a terrifying plot against not just him, but his family, the Baron Conspiracy, with the goal being to drive the king and his family from the kingdom and choose someone else as king in his place. This plot was quickly resolved, and the 2 barons implicated in the plot fled abroad. By 1213, King John was enacting his plan for the reconquest of his lands in France. The money he had raised over the years was finally put to use. He had made peace with the Pope and the Welsh. King John's allies were now ready to strike. Yet still, the northern barons refused to give military service, again stating that they owed no service for lands in France. By November 1213, King John had issued summons to bring 4 knights from each county in England to meet at Oxford with their weapons of war. And finally, in February 1214, King John launched his reconquest. By the middle of September 1214, he failed. His allies had been defeated at the Battle of Bouvines, and King John made peace with the French for 5 years. All his plans were now a pile of ash, and he was politically weak. King John knew he faced a political fallout and tried to conduct damage control, sending 2 loyal men to secure castles in England. There was also the church still demanding compensation for the looting that occurred during the interdict, but rumours were widely circulating that the barons were seeking to rebel, and King John prepared to face this uprising by hiring mercenaries. Even the Pope tried to curtail any uprisings by writing to one baron that they should not stand in the way of the king's justices and government officials. Yet refusals to pay taxes from some of the shires of England was already happening in 1214. Several barons met at Bury, St. Edmunds, where the topic was unsurprisingly about King John and how to deal with him. Here we see the barons were presented with a charter from the reign of King Henry I, King John's great-grandfather. The man presenting this charter was the Archbishop of Canterbury. To summarize this charter from 1100, it sought to fix bad laws and the excessive amount of taxation towards the shires of England, and also payments of inheritance. The scope of these details would be used towards legislating the Magna Carta. By January 1215, King John and the barons met on neutral ground. The barons sought to make the king abide by the 1100 charter, whereas King John sought to play for time to build up his forces and seek papal help. The barons did the same. But the Pope was firmly on the side of his vassal. Tensions were mounting, with both the king and the baron preparing for a major war between them. And by June 1215, both sides met at Runnymede, another place of neutral ground. King John had arrived well prepared. He had an army of mercenaries near the coast, and he had the full backing of the Pope, even more so after giving crusading vows. The issue of paying scutage to the king was also now a moot point for the barons, as the Pope dealt with that issue as well. The barons were now backed into a corner in terms of negotiations. They had one card to play, rescinding their oaths to the king on the 5th of May. The barons had a strong ally in the Archbishop of Canterbury, who would mediate and try to find a resolution for both parties. As for King John, he still needed time to build up his forces. His plan was to copy what his father had always done when dealing with discontent, push the discontented into a corner and crush them when they rose up. Yet King John had pushed too many different factions into a corner: the barons, the Londoners, knights, etc. Now they were one faction, and at Runnymede, the terms of the 1215 version of the Magna Carta were sealed. Yet there was never any peace before and after the sealing of the Magna Carta. Implementing the charter was one issue. The other is that King John was never going to abide by the charter. Why would he? He was a sworn vassal of the Pope. His barons could not enforce any treaty onto him without the consent of his liege lord, the Pope. And with that, the First Barons' War began. The barons finally sought to replace King John with Prince Louis, King Philip's son and heir. Prince Louis could claim the throne of England thanks to his marriage to Blanche of Castile, King John's niece. And by October 1216, King John had lost half of the Kingdom of England to the rebel barons and Prince Louis. King John was now also sick with dysentery and constant pains in his legs. King John, the last Angevin king, died between the 18th and 19th of October, 1216. Now that we've covered the life of King John, the final part is to look at his legacy. The first part is that he left England embroiled in a civil war and a young heir, his son Henry, who, with the support of some loyal barons such as William Marshal, would lead the royal forces to victory and attempt to re-establish royal authority for young King Henry when he became of age. The most important part of King John's legacy is the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, although King John probably wouldn't like that. However, the first charter failed. King John violated rights that already existed in English law, but for England and its people, Magna Carta provided a stepping stone towards a modern constitution over the centuries. John's overall legacy is a negative one. He was cruel, with a dark sense of humour, paranoid, and just a horrible person to deal with. The murder of his nephew Arthur, in my opinion, is the worst moment in his reign. The act of committing nepticide is just another damning aspect of King John's reign, and is one reason of many why he is considered a bad king. There are numerous other examples: the hounding of the Brioche family, and the fate of the son and wife of William de Brioche. William, who at one point was King John's closest ally. If King John treated his allies this way, then it's not a stretch of the imagination to wonder the fate of Duke Arthur. John was also a bad king for a prosperous time. While King John did order the creation of significant castles and cities, both in England and Ireland, I believe that King John was the wrong king to take full advantage of the growth of early 13th century England. Also, his actions led to the First Barons' War, which to the people of England caused suffering. England had not experienced a civil war since the anarchy. As for his burial site, Worcester Cathedral was the best place for him, given the circumstances he died in. And down the centuries, John being buried in Worcester saved his remains, as if he was buried with most of his family at Fontevraud Abbey. His remains would have been disturbed during the French Revolution. It's rather sad that King John isn't around any of his immediate family. Even his children were entombed elsewhere, as were both his wives. The closest family member entombed near him is a descendant several centuries down the line. A historical irony is that the entombed descendant is Arthur Tudor, at one point the heir to the throne of England, as had Arthur, Duke of Brittany, had been. It's ironic King John shares his resting place near an Arthur, and in another twist, having Arthur Tudor entombed at Worcester may have saved King John's own tomb from destruction by the dissolution of the monasteries enacted by King Henry VIII, Prince Arthur's younger brother. It seems even in death, King John encounters tremendous luck and terrible bad luck. When we first started this series, we looked at King John's reputation during different time periods and examined what the people of those periods said about King John during his life and after his death. There were hardly any contemporary chroniclers that spoke highly of King John. The Anonymous of Bethune mentions King John being a good host. It didn't help that some of the chroniclers of King John's time were members of the clergy, meaning they certainly had a bias towards him, although some did work with King John directly, such as Gerald of Wales. Gerald experienced King John's vile personality firsthand, but as we move along the timeline into Tudor England, King John's legacy was used to portray as a sort of hero fighting the evil Pope. This is when England broke away from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, and John was used as an unlikely hero given he was the first English monarch to be excommunicated by the Catholic Church and was forced to capitulate towards the Pope. As we move forward in time into the Victorian age, John's reputation and legacy come under renewed focus due to British nationalism and imperialism, with Victorian historians focusing on John's loss of French lands in 1204, giving England the means to develop its own identity and forge its national destiny, according to Victorian historians. For our time, the question is, what do we do with King John's legacy and reputation? He still is, and forever will be, Bad King John.